I'm very pleased to introduce our guest, who everybody knows in SABR, Mr. FX Flinn, who served many years as our treasurer, and we have lots of money, or so they tell us, available, and we're in good shape. I didn't know this till Derek pointed it out, that he had actually written these books on rotisserie baseball, or had been part of them many years ago. I'm really hoping, I'm in my first rotisserie league this year. Derek convinced me to come in, and I think I'm in about 12th place in a 5-team league. So I really need some help. But we will go from that. I might share an FX story later. I haven't got many, but I do have one. So I am just going to pass it off to you, FX. If you want share screen or anything, just let us know. We'll make that happen. Okay, you're muted, FX.
Unmute, FX.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's I think the first warm, beautiful night up in Vermont. And so I'm doing this out on the deck on my iPhone instead of at my battle station. And this is such a thrill to be at a meeting that I am not the host of, and that doesn't have like 70 people on it, and is about fun stuff. I've been really involved with the effort to get broadband out into rural Vermont since the pandemic started. That was really the biggest reason why I had to get off the SABR board. But at the very last minute today, I suddenly realized, holy smokes, I should find out if my buddy Doug would be willing to or want to come and attend, because Doug and I met very early on, and Doug has a distinction that I do not, which is that he was a member of the American Dreams League in 1981, which was really and truly the first American League version of the Rotisserie League. But it broke up over a dispute about how to handle the baseball strike in 1981. Well, while that baseball strike was going on, I was not aware of any of those arguments. I was dating a young woman that I had met at Doubleday, and as it happened, she called her buddy from Mount Holyoke, who was working at Sports Illustrated, and she said, "Hey, Bambi, I'm going out with this guy I like, and he's taking me to Yankee games." And Bambi was like, "Oh, that's interesting. We could double date, because I'm dating the guy who writes about baseball for Sports Illustrated, a guy named Steve Wolf." And so that's how I wound up meeting one of the founding fathers of Rotisserie League Baseball. And Steve and I hit it off. And of course, Becky and Bambi were old pals from Mount Holyoke. I wound up marrying Becky. Steve wound up marrying Bambi. But one of the first fruits of these relationships was the book Rotisserie League Baseball, which came out in 1984. Steve got me into one of the fragments, one of the halves of the American Dreams League, which consisted of all the people who agreed with the founding fathers on how to handle the strike. And one of those guys was Doug Garr. So Doug, you were kind of present at the creation. Why don't you give your rundown?
Oh, I'm so pleased that you invited me, FX, because this brought back so many really cool memories. And I'll start out a little bit later, because when Rotisserie League Baseball became the fantasy league juggernaut that it is today, I recall sending Steve Wolf an email saying, Steve, when only 36 people in the world played this, it was like really cool. Now that there's 30 million playing it, I really don't care. And he wrote back and he said, yeah. And I will point out that when New York City had, I'm going backwards here because it's really a cool story and I know FX appreciates it, is that when New York City had Rotisserie League Baseball Day, they had a great little documentary going on and they interviewed all of the really cool sports writers and all the people that were funny and witty that had were in the first 2 or 3 leagues. And Steve refused to participate in this day. And one of the great quotes of all time was when Steve Wolf said, when I die, my tombstone, if I discovered the cure for cancer tomorrow, my epitaph would read, he founded Rotisserie League Baseball. So I just got to say what a cool guy Steve Wolf was, and FX knows this. When I first got invited into the league, it was Glenn Wagner, who was a sports writer who had gone way back with all the great Texas sports writers. And they thought I was like, oh, we need a couple of fish in this. And I was a baseball fan, but I didn't follow it closely. So when I got into the first draft and FX was there, he'll remember this, the only thing you could really look at was Bill James' baseball abstract. And Bill James's early paperbacks were kind of flaky. Some of it was really good data and the other stuff was total bullcrap. How a player played on his birthday, stuff that was totally useless. So we were all doing this, and it was, don't forget, there was no internet. We were all calling. You call somebody up to make a trade that worked on as a sports writer on a newspaper to get inside info. Anyway, when I decided to join, I said, wow, these guys are all smart. They're all fun. They're all, I don't know what they know about baseball. So I delved into it. And all I thought was, of the 12 teams, I just don't want to finish in the 3rd division. I just don't want to come in last. And I studied every morning. I got to my office and I opened up Sporting News and I studied like a banshee so I wouldn't be that one that was stupid at the draft. So now I'll turn it back to FX so he can kind of reminisce, ask questions, or any of you can of the two of us.
Yeah, so that was it was really quite an experience to go to the first meeting of the junior league at Glenn Wagner's apartment near the American Museum of Natural History on the Upper West Side, and Glenn was holding forth as only he could, and then he springs on us a single piece of paper, typed up, single space, paper edge to paper edge, 2 sides, and says, here are the rules, and I'd like to introduce you to the man who wrote them. Here's Dan Okrent. And I was like, oh my God, Dan Okrent. Oh, holy crap. This is I knew who Dan Okrent was, back then, even though he had not yet become the editor of Life magazine. He had not yet become the New York Times first ombudsman. By the way, Dan Okrent sends his regards and regrets that due to a long-standing engagement tonight, he could not also participate. But he did say, ask me again. So you guys, I think, let's reschedule and try and do this again sometime maybe late in 2024. And we can get the Dan himself here. And who knows, maybe I can even talk Wolfie into it. But at the time, I had just changed jobs in the publishing business. I had been at Doubleday, and had I worked those Mets tickets, it was really a racket. But anyway, then I went over to Bantam as the managing editor for hardcover and trade paperbacks. So I'm like, I don't know, 26, 27 years old, and I'm living in Manhattan, and this stuff is starting to happen, and I'm close to some cool stuff. Like I'm working on Jimmy Carter's first book out of the White House, Keeping Faith, and I'm starting to plug into the whole New York City publishing scene. But I'm a managing editor, which means I'm mostly the traffic cop between the editorial department and the production department and the publicity department and the legal department and the art department and the sales department and I report really more to the publisher than to the editor in chief. And so it was a very interesting role, because I got to see everything going on throughout the company, and I had an opportunity to interact with all the executives. We call them C-level suite people today, and the department heads. And I was in that phase of my career where I was just taking, right? I was like learning everything. And I realized that one of the ways books happened was that somebody in the publishing company thought, oh, you know what? If we get this author to write about this, that would be a book. That would be something that would sell in the market. And my reaction after I met the Rotisserie League people was that, number one, all of them were connected in some way or shape or form to the publishing business. There was Lee Eisen, who at the time was the editor of Esquire magazine, and of course Steve Wolf at Sports Illustrated, and Dan Okrent had the New England Monthly magazine, right, and and so on and so forth. If you have a copy of the original Rotisserie League book and you go through it, I think the people who were least connected were like Michael Pollan, who was the attorney, except he was the attorney for all these editors and writers, so he knew everybody. And then there's Bruce McClure. Now he wasn't an author, but my God, he's had now about 50 covers that he's done for the New Yorker, and he does these hysterical one-page pieces of art that are just mind-blowing and funny every time he produces one. And I went to the publisher and I said, Jack, this is Jack Romanos, who went on to a fabulous career in publishing. He's still around. We should ask him to come too. Anyway, I said, Jack, I'm doing this baseball thing where it's a group of people, and we each get to spend $260, and at an auction we populate a team with 20 players, and we compile stats in 4 hitting categories and 4 pitching categories, and you get points depending on your standings in each of those 8 categories, and whoever has the most points at the end of the year wins. So it's basically like a fantasy version of baseball. And what I want to do is, these guys who invented it, there are 12 of them. They're all in publishing, or they're writers. I'll have each one do a chapter, and we'll have a book. And I think we can publish it next February when spring training starts. And I'm sure we could sell 25,000 copies, and it would be a good mid-list trade paperback for us, you know? And so he listens to all this and he looks at me and he goes, no. So that was, in fact, the Thursday before Labor Day, 1983. The following Tuesday, I sneak into my office about 9:45. So I'm like, 45 minutes late. And I'm sitting there and I'm trying to like gear up after having not been in the office since early Friday afternoon, 4 days earlier. And Jack Romanos, the publisher, the guy I report to most of the time, sticks his head in the office, and I'm like, oh no, he's really going to give me crap for being late. And he goes, FX, that thing you were talking to me about, is Crinsley in that? Now,
Jamie.
who is Dick Crinsley? No,
Dick.
Not Jamie. Dick.
Oh no, Jimmy. Yeah, right. Dick Crinsley. Yeah.
Okay, so Dick Crinsley, Jamie's dad, was the publisher at Scholastic Books. Okay, and Dick was one of the people who was in the junior league. He and his son had a team called the Filial Follies.
Right, the Filial
Right?
Follies. Yeah.
And his son and I were the same age, and we got along famously. And so I looked at Jack and I said, yeah. And he goes, okay, do the book. And he leaves my office and he heads down the hall. Well, I was not going to have that. I'm sorry. So I stood up and I marched down the hall. I caught him about 2/3 of the way to his office. And I'm like, Jack, okay, great. Thank you. But that's really not fair. What happened? And he goes, okay. So we walk into his office. He closes the door and he goes, I went to 3 different parties up in Connecticut this weekend. Crinsley was at all of them. All people were doing were hanging on every word he had about this rotisserie league thing, this baseball thing. And everybody was like, oh. And Peter Gethers was there and he was going on and on about it. And I was like, oh yeah, well, Gethers, he's the guy who discovered Bill James. And they're selling like 150,000 copies a year, on that. And so his eyes widen up and he goes, so like I said, do it. So anyway, armed with that directive, I called Dan and I said, look, why don't we do this? We'll do a book contract. Each of you guys will get $2,000 advance. Each write a chapter, and I know Glenn's not a writer because he wasn't then. He went on to become a terrific one, but at the time, no, he was like running
Barnes and Noble's division. Yeah.
Yeah.
He worked for Lenny Riggio. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I said, Glenn and will get the rules sorted out. And all I need from you guys is that I need you to pull out all the stops on the PR. We're going to need another article in the New York Times like you had 3 years ago. You're going to have to get Bryant Gumbel, who's playing unlimited dollar rotisserie with his peers, to do stuff on the Today Show. That's how we're going to make this, because Bantam, this is going to be a mid-list book for Bantam. They're not going to spend any money on this stuff. So they were like, okay, that's cool. We'll do that. So we had a few lunches to kick around ideas, and we, got the outline put together. And I called Glenn And I said, you have to run herd on these guys because I already have a full-time job, and and then you and I will work on the rules. And so the summer of '83, I would meet Glenn. I met Glenn about 5 or 6 times at a diner on the Upper West Side. And we would go through, we would take that single piece of paper, which I had, which I got retyped. Back in those days, they had like secretarial pools. So you give them assignments. I was like, here, retype this double spaced with smaller margins. And we mark that up and got it retyped. And then we'd go through that, and Glenn would tell these funny stories, and I would write them down. And so when you read the rules, they've got these, italicized parenthetical comments about them. And that's all Glenn's like humor coming out when I ask him these ridiculous Catholic school questions about, how many angels dance on the head of a pin, and what happens if this happens, and what about the rules don't seem to say anything about this. So we were also literally like cleaning up the rules and adding little tweaks to the rules. We were trying to come up with a set of rules that were pretty resilient and resistant to manipulation by people of bad intent, which is one of the reasons why I think a lot of people don't like the Rotisserie League rules, because they're kind of tight in that regard. So anyway, that was how the book came to be. Go ahead, Doug.
So I have to add to this. The first, in the '82 draft of our league, I had been writing an article. I had written an article for Omni magazine at the time called Computers and Kids. And I went out to Queens to this high school where they had been donated mainframes from banks, and all the like smart kids were programming already. So I interviewed all these kids, and I'm going to the draft. And the first thing that I said to one of the smart kids, I remember him, Greg Troutman, he later became a star in programming. I said, Greg, you got to write an algorithm. You got to write a program so I can get the best hitters and the best pitchers in the league. So when I go to the draft, I'll know how much money to spend on these guys. So he does all this work with his friends, all this computer work. We walk into Glenn's apartment, as FX was saying. We go into the first draft. I have if you remember the old computer paper, they were on tractor feeds. So I have all this paper, I'm trying to psych these guys out. And I go in there, and Dan Oakrant looks at me like, what's that? I said, well, I have a computer analysis of every single player in the American League. And he's like laughing at me. And I go, yeah, watch out. So this kid, Greg Troutman, had said in 1982, he said, the one guy you got to get is Robin Yount. And he goes, Robin Yount, he's a 4-tool player for Rotisserie League. So I have in my mind that no matter what happens, I'm getting Robin Yount. So the bidding comes up, Yount's announced, and I ended up paying $23 for Robin Yount. And the average price for a Rotisserie League player was about $12 and change. So I paid $23 for Yount. And Yount, of course, that was the year he had his MVP year. And 82. And it was incredible. I went from 7th to 4th place in the last 3 weeks and got a piece of the prize pool. So I thought, not only did I not embarrass myself, but I cashed my first year. The next year, because of the way the rules were made, we got to keep certain players for long-term contracts if you added on to, for 1, 2, or 3 years, $5 a year. So I had, coming in 4th, I'm feeling pretty good. I've got a good team. The next year, 83, goes on, and about midway through the year, my soon to be my wife and I were having difficulties in our marriage, but everything. So, the first thing I had heard was, if you're doing Rotisserie League, you have to have 2 phone lines, one for trading and one for life. And I was laughing at that because remember that, FX? That was like so funny. And so I'm on the phone all the time. And in mid-year, I'm like hovering around 3rd, 2nd place, and I'm in the running. And my wife Meg at the time was saying like, you better like win this thing. And I said, Meg, this was like in August. And I said, Meg, if I win, I'm taking you to Paris and we'll stay at the Ritz Hotel. And she said, okay. So he comes down to the last couple of weeks of the season. I'm in first place. And I'm going like, oh God, I gotta hang on here. And the last couple of weeks, I hung in. And in '83, I won the pennant. And a few months later, we checked into the Ritz. And this made it into one of Pete Golenbach's book, because it's a great story. We're checking into the Ritz. Next to me is Mick Jagger. I'm going like, look who's here, you know? We go to the Ritz, we check in, and Meg said to me, baseball has been very, very good to me.
Well,
Yeah, it doesn't
Doug,
get any better than that.
so there are two great laws of Rotisserie League. Well, there are three great laws of Rotisserie League baseball. The first great law of Rotisserie League baseball is Okrent's law. Nobody cares about your Rotisserie League team except you. The second law is any winnings from Rotisserie League baseball are to be spent on your spouse or other loved ones who have put up with you. And the third law of Rotisserie League baseball is that, I guess this isn't a law. I guess this is just a statement of fact. The best strategy is pure dumb luck.
But don't forget, Danny, that in '82, Danny spent $42 for Ricky Henderson. And we thought like he's out of his mind. I think that was the year he stole 130 bags. And he ran away with the title. It wasn't even close the whole season, FX.
Oh, that's absolutely true. And people began to realize, one of the things that I saw was that there was a psychological barrier that at $40 that people were so resistant to going over. Yet there were players who were worth high 40, low 50. And if they had a season, like Ricky Henderson's, they could be worth, close to $90. And that insight was one that I kind of kept, close to the vest. And I was pretty successful in profiting on players that I decided to spend high 30s or high 40s on. But I had terrible, for a long time, I wasn't a very good rotisserie player. I would say it took me about a decade to really feel like I had things in hand. And then I had about a decade, actually I had 15 years of finishing second or third or fourth 80% of the time. And that was very frustrating. It would always be like, somebody would blow a save on the last day of the season. There was one terrible year where I lost by a half a point, and it was like some guy who had never missed all season blew us. Anyway, I'm sure you all have those stories, and I have to remember Okrent's law. But anyway, when I finally won, it was so weird because it was the 08 season. I a really intense responsibilities. I had no opportunity to really prepare. And so I looked at the free agent pool and I decided that I would go in, I would buy the two big closers, and then I would trade my way from there. And I wound up in a situation where I leapt out into first place. And I also had what's his name? But he won 10 straight games at the beginning of the season. And Lee, and I traded him for Youkilis in early June. And Youkilis hit like 430 the rest of the way. And he had like 120 RBIs that year, and I got 105 of them from June to the end of September. And I won going away. And it was like, there was no strategy, beyond getting those two closers. And you know what? I'd never traded either of those two guys because nobody wanted them, because nobody wanted to make a run for the pennant. So it was like, it was just a weird situation. And no sooner had the season ended than I got a call from the guys who were making a silly little game, which was one of the first 30 for 30 ESPN shows. And he said, everybody in the Rotisserie League is saying that I have to talk to you. And so, I told him a lot of these stories. And anyway, he wound up coming to our draft and shot a lot of talking head stuff with me and with Jamie Crinsley, actually. And then they filmed our Yoo-Hoo ceremony, which we always did at the draft. And we really did the Yoo-Hoo ceremony. So if you ever watch A Silly Little Game, episode 6 or 7 of 30 for 30, when the title comes up in the opening, the shot is of a guy getting Yoo-Hooed, and that's me. And so it was like I was 28 years waiting to win my first, or 18, let's see, what was it? 26 years to win my first pennant. And then I got this great gift, And,
You're like the Cubs. You were like the Cubs in Rotisserie League Baseball.
Yeah. And then I won again a decade later. I was living up in Vermont. They were all down in Stamford, Connecticut. So I
have to point out one really cool thing about this, because FX and I were around in the early days with sports writers. We were always with, you'd run into major league players all the time, like at all these events. I would go to the sports all these dinners, where the major league players would be at the end of the year, it was the Golden Gloves or the New York City sports writers, whatever. And whenever you ran into one of these guys, and Steve Wolf would always introduce you to the guys he was covering. And the biggest thing that was on their mind when Rotisserie League Baseball really got to take off was they'd say, like, I remember Quisenberry sitting at the bar next to Dan Quisenberry, and he goes like, how much did I go for at the auction?
Right.
Their worst fear was that they went for $1. If and you didn't want to, I got you for $2.
Right.
They were like, that would be the worst thing in their, forget negotiating $1 million contracts. It was like Rotisserie League Baseball, I went for $1. I mean, that FX, I'll never forget that. They were all, you play that? How much did I go for at the auction?
Well,
it was hilarious.
Do you remember when that in the Pine Tar game, when it resumed, Brett played second base, and they were like, why did you do that? And Brett said, I wanted to make myself more valuable in Rotisserie League Baseball. And
yeah, he qualified at middle infield. Yes,
that's right. He qualified at middle infield. And so many years later, I was consulting for Harley Davidson, and I would fly out to, I would commute on Monday mornings from my house in Vermont, which is not far from the Lebanon, New Hampshire airport, and back before the attacks on September 11th, there were like 8 flights a day, and 2 of them went to Philadelphia, and so I'd fly to Philadelphia, fly to Kansas City, and I'd be at my desk at that Harley Davidson plant working on software for their assembly line at like 9:15 in the morning KC time. Well, one day I got to the airport to fly back, and the miles were really piling up, and I got an upgrade, and I'm up front in first class, and I sit and I get on, and who am I sitting directly behind? George Brett. So at some point, I had an opportunity to, engage with him a little bit. And the first words out of my mouth were, "Hey, George, I was involved in getting the Rotisserie League thing going. And I got to personally thank you for saying the reason you wanted to play second in the Pine Tar game was to increase your Rotisserie League value." We were all like so thrilled and gratified that you had done that and that there was no blowback, because we were all worried that Major League Baseball was going to deem that to be betting, and like the people who were playing in it, who were sports writers, would somehow, Steve Wolf worried about that a lot, but when you said that and there was no blowback, that really opened the door. And he was like, "Oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that." He goes, "But I was dead serious. I knew that there was this middle infielder position." And I said, "Oh yeah, you can blame me for that." And he was like, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, in the first year I played rotisserie, I went to the auction and I'm like, well, that's too much for that third baseman. That's too much for that first baseman. But but that shortstop, that he's going for a good price. That second baseman, he's going for a good price." So all the other guys were like, "Oh, you're allowed to have 4 corner players? Of course I'm going to load up on them. Who cares about who cares about the defense, right? And they're going to hit home runs. The middle infielders aren't." And I started like looking at the rules, and this was before the books. This would have been in 1982. And so when the 1982 season ended, I did this whole treatise that I presented at the winter meeting of the Junior League, that instead of there being 2 first basemen, 2 third basemen, a second baseman, and a shortstop, there should be a first baseman, a third baseman, a corner position qualified for first or third, a second base shortstop, and a middle infield position qualified for second or shortstop. And that would meet better Dan Okren's rule of thumb that we should be using about 80% of the players in the league. And we were using like 100% of the corners, and we were using like 60% of the middle infielders, and that this would restore the balance. So the Junior League actually adopted that rule. And because there were 5 or 6 people from the Rotisserie League who were in the Junior League, shortly after that, maybe a month later, the Rotisserie League adopted that.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So yeah, I do take credit for or blame. I take the blame for the middle infield.
No. You advanced the rules, FX, and I wanted to point out something that today's people, even my son who plays, do not appreciate in fantasy league baseball. When we started this thing, we had the reporting was, the only reporting for the stats was in the Sporting News. And we had a secretary, Glenn's secretary, I think it was, that did the stats by hand every 2 weeks, because it was too expensive to hire her to do it every week. So you went 14 days of baseball without really knowing how well your team was doing. You had a vague idea who was hitting, who was pitching, blah, blah, blah. So we didn't have instantaneous feedback the way today is. Every batted ball, every pitch, you can find out how your team is doing. We did not have that.
That is like just like so unbelievable. Hey, Doug, you know what? I think we've hit all the high points of the origin.
Okay, sorry.
Why don't we stop and take questions?
Okay, sorry about that.
No,
Okay.
no, you're fine. And that was like the next important thing that needed to be said. So
okay.
It's interesting. I could listen to the stories, I'm sure, all night long. But like you said, we'll take questions now. So if anybody's got one, jump in.
Hey, guys, I have a question. So, and I jumped in a little bit late, so you might have discussed this a little bit, but so my question is, do you play today? Do you guys still play, or is that something of the past?
I had to stop after 2018. The league that I was in had been pretty stable from 1986 when Jamie Crinsley and I formed it in Stamford because we wanted to have a league that was closer to where we lived. And we wound up having a league with 5 doctors, 5 lawyers, and 2 IT people. The Stamford Rotisserie League, where doctors and lawyers are happy together. And we did a lot of work. I think we did a lot of very imaginative work with the rules within the confines of the Rotisserie League concept. And as time wore on and the game changed, they really did start to make it less fun for people who were coming in new. And between 2010 and 2015, we had about 6 new teams come in. And there were a couple of new owners who were very motivated to make rule changes. And I found myself arguing about like the philosophy of the rules and what was behind the Rotisserie League, and acknowledging that the game had changed and making some suggestions for what we might do. And they were all in the direction of, Doug, you'll appreciate this. They were all in the direction of Rotisserie League Ultra, where you have a deep bench and all that.
Yeah.
But they didn't want to go in that direction. They basically wanted to get rid of things like the slot tracking that was designed to prevent benefiting from an injury. And, so if you got a good player because you reserved an injured player and then the injured player came back, the rules basically forced you to take that player back.
Yes.
And you had to find another way of getting the injured player into a different slot. Otherwise, you had to get rid of the good player. And that happened to me. That happened to me in my championship season because I wanted to keep 2 players. Yeah.
I was Mike Boddicker and I forgot who replaced him. And I had 2 great Baltimore pitchers at the time, and the rules did not allow me to switch. But I wanted to say another thing. In those days, today you have instant information on injuries. Who's on the IL, who's coming off, you can research this up the kazoo. In the old days, you had to, because we were all involved in the news media, excuse me, you would call up somebody that you knew at the Sacramento Bee, or you call up somebody at the San Francisco Chronicle and say, all right, this guy on the A's, I'm thinking about trading for him. Is his arm okay? So it was
This is why I
inside.
didn't win for so long.
You didn't do all the inside info stuff. But I learned that early on from guys like Glenn and Glenn Wagner and Danny and Peter Gethers. They had no shame. So I immediately got no shame. That's all.
Well, anyway, so they went ahead and they voted in a bunch of rule changes. And I was just like, you know what? Not fun. I think I'll just take a break. And, it was, so I didn't play in 2019. Then the pandemic happened. That was a messed up year. And in 2021, they asked me to come back. But by that time, I was so involved with what I'm doing around broadband in Vermont, I really don't have the headspace for really anything else. I mean, I in addition to dropping rotisserie, I also dropped being on the SABR board. Really, my involvement with baseball right now, aside from occasionally watching some play now, and I love the new rules, I have to say. It's really the involvement with the calculation of the Gold Glove votes that SABR casts every year. You know, that's something that I've been doing since we first got that contract. And that's my principal connection into baseball right now.
Interesting.
I played 15 seasons or so, and then I realized I didn't have the time, Andy, to, you know, if you want to be serious about it, you've got to spend a couple of hours a day keeping up on it. And I didn't want to be non-serious about it.
Yeah, you do, Doug. And one of the things, I've been running 2 leagues as commissioner since 1989. And one of the things that I noticed is that we were impacted quite a bit by by COVID, because we used to do our auctions live every year. And that break that we were forced to take in 2020 and 2021 really caused actually a couple of owners to drop out and drop out forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's sad.
Yeah.
It was great. I got to tell you, it's a great thing. And, you know, my son plays fantasy football, and, you know, it's like every one of his friends play it, and he loves to brag about it. He said, my dad was there at the beginning, you know, and I always feel good about that when he talks about it.
Yep. Yep.
Well,
Go ahead.
I've got more of a comment than a question, I guess.
Oh.
My friend Chris Price introduced me, I don't know if you can see this, to this book back in probably around 1987. And I went down the rabbit hole. And, let's see here. So you can see all these. That's about half of them. That's half of them. But I think I've got 17 of the 20 books or so that came out. But yeah, I remember we started up about 1988. And the league that I'm currently in, my hometown league, we've been doing since '92. We used to meet in person, but, you know, people move away, you know, so it's great that we can draft remote now.
Yeah.
30 years.
Derek,
that's great.
Derek, that's great. And I'll tell you, we didn't really talk about it, but you know, so Peter Gethers was an editor at Ballantine Books. And Peter got involved with the first Rotisserie League. And then that summer, he would go into, or what I should say is that in anticipation of the first Rotisserie League auction, Peter went through the classifieds of the Sporting News. And again, you couldn't go online. You had to go through the classifieds. And he basically wound up ordering every single tip sheet, every single, you know, book where people were offering their thoughts about baseball. And so he got a pile of stuff in the mail, and he started looking through it. And, you know, then he opened up this book called The Baseball Abstract from Bill James. And he did not go to sleep until he finished reading through that. And he called Bill James and he said, do you have any earlier copies that I can buy? And Bill said, oh yeah. He goes, I'll send them to you. So he did. And within 2 weeks, Peter had signed Bill to a contract. And the following spring, the Bill James Baseball Abstract for 1982 came out. And in that book, in the forward of that book, Bill James writes that what he does, he calls sabermetrics in honor of the members of SABR who had helped and encouraged him in his research and his writing. And I think it's important to remember that back then, in 1979, 1980, 1981, when Bill was writing his first baseball abstracts, Bill was a member of SABR. SABR only had 600 or 700 members. It had been put together to give people who wanted to write about baseball an audience. And that's what the Baseball Research Journal was about, that the first decade of SABR. And so what Bill unleashed, because SABR existed, wound up quadrupling or quintupling SABR's membership in the 3 years, 1982, 83, 84. And for the last 25 years, for the last generation, the SABR Board of Directors has been dominated by people who joined in 1982, 1983, 1984. That was the huge surge of energy into SABR that wound up transforming it from a kind of a little hobbyist group to a real force in the baseball industry. And you know, you guys are all part of that. Absolutely.
I have one little story I want to share with you guys that I think you'll appreciate, because it really warmed my heart. My son has a big job on the West Coast. He lives in LA. He works for an esports company. And he's always like traveling with, you know, heavy duty people and the rich and famous. One night he calls me up. He goes, "Dad, I'm at this dinner, you know, guess who I'm sitting next to?" And I said, "Okay, what celebrity are you sitting next to?" He goes, "I'll give you a hint." I said, "Okay, give me a hint." He goes, "Moneyball." And I went, "Brad Pitt or Billy Bean?" Right? What else, right? He goes, "Billy Bean." And I go, "Holy shit." You know, and you guys, I mean, if anybody had an impact on statistics and the way baseball is GM today. And I said, "So?" And he goes, "Well, we exchanged emails. He's a really cool guy." I thought, I was so envious at that moment. But then I thought, well, that's my son, right? You know, so I had to share that.
Cool.
And just think, Doug, if you hadn't won in '83 and taken Meg to Paris, who knows?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And when I told Pete Golenbach that story, he was like, "I got to put this in the book." I said, "Yeah, be my guest."
So, okay, I have a question for you guys.
Oh, can
I've
Jason
won-
ask his first?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Jason, we can't hear you.
I got it.
There we go.
How about now?
There
Got
we
it.
go.
Oh, I don't know what happened to my mic. Okay. So just a quick plug, since you mentioned it, the SABRcast this week interview with Michael Lewis was quite a great one. If you haven't or if you don't listen to that regularly, they went back and tells a lot of great stories about the creation of that book. So this is a comment followed by a question. So I got involved in rotisserie. I'm younger than many of you. I was in junior high school, and my friend got me into a league in 1983. And the way that league, the way it was set up was a little different. But anyway, I had to. I ended up drafting, and I just remember two players who I had who were very big in my winning that league were Lloyd Mosby and Willie Upshaw. I had great years in '83. And I'm reminded, because I'm staring at this Blue Jays flag, And it made me think, I became a bit of a Blue Jays fan, even as a Southern Californian, because I got very caught up in the success of those players. So I was kind of curious if you guys, if your rooting interests or your favorite players came out of your rotisserie play, as some of mine started to become, because it became this, the guys I cared the most about, and their teams started to matter more to me. So I'm just kind of curious if it changed who you were as a fan.
I have to say one quick thing before FX grabs the floor. In that first year, I was at Yankee Stadium for a game with one of my buddies who was a pretty big baseball fan, and we're sitting next to each other, and it was an Oakland A's game. And I had two guys on the A's and two guys on the Yankees. So every time my guys got up, I would be cheering for them. And the people in back of us are going like, you know, does this guy, he goes, do you know anything about baseball? And my friend Larry looks back at him and he goes, yes, he does. Trust me. And at that point, I just like laughed, you know, does this guy know? You know, I mean, he's rooting for both teams. No, he's not. That triggered that anecdote.
Okay. I root for shirts. I root for the New York Yankees, and no manner of rotisserie league involvement will change that. However, I was at the 2 playoff games in 1995 against Seattle at Yankee Stadium, and in the second game, this rookie came out and threw these 4 innings, and the way that the catcher's mitt popped when his fastball hit it made me say, I don't care what it takes, I'm getting that guy next year. Mariano Rivera, $4. FX Flinn.
I knew that. Knew the answer to that one.
Anyway, yeah, and so Mariano was behind a lot of those second place finishes in the in the later half of the 90s. Anyway, but I will say that my younger brother loved the whole idea of rotisserie, and he got involved, and he played it for about 3 years, and then we were talking that at Christmas, at the end of that 3rd year, and he said, I'm done. I'm not playing rotisserie anymore. And I said, why? He said I hate it when I'm watching a game and, you know, one of my players comes up and I sort of like have to root against the Yankees. You know, I can't. He goes, you can apparently disassociate at some level on that, but I can't. I'm done. I'm out.
Yeah.
And you know, and that was fine. You know, I think everybody needs to find their own way. I will say this. This reminds me of something else about the origins of Rotisserie League Baseball. It was baked and broiled on the Spitfire of George Steinbrenner owning the Yankees in New York. Not everybody who was involved in Rotisserie League was a Yankees fan, but many were, and many of them thought if they were somebody with George Steinbrenner's money and George Steinbrenner's passion, they could do a hell of a lot better than George Steinbrenner. And they wanted to find a way to prove it. And Rotisserie League Baseball was that way.
Yeah, that's true. I definitely think that, you know, become your own general manager. We all, you know, had that fantasy that, you know, we could do better than these guys. And we had the difference was we had the limited payroll. You know, I ran into Roger Angel before he died at a point when I had just come off my couple of really good seasons. And I mentioned to him, and he said, now, I mean, this is Roger fucking Angel. And he said years ago, a bunch of sports writers and I got together and we did a very primitive version of what became Rotisserie League Baseball. You know, we would be sitting around and 5 or 6 guys said, let's pick some players, and whoever gets the most stats at the end, you know, has to buy, you know, gets the beer or whatever it was. But Roger Angel was into the idea of this, and the dean of American baseball writing, you know, the GOAT. So that was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. I never heard that one.
Well,
that's
you know, I had sent them a story of my first season. Roger Angel sent me the rejection letter, and he said it's a great story, and then he explained explained to why, you know, it was a little too limited, but he thought it was well written, and I was happy about that. No, Roger was, yeah, they had that kind of like thing going on. They had gone to so many baseball games, you know, so yeah, it was a great, you know, I can't believe it's like, what, 40 years?
Oh yeah, no, it's, and you know, the Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame, held a 25th anniversary event up in Cooperstown in 2006, and I'll never forget the sports columnist for the Wall Street Journal. I'm spacing on his name, but he was the moderator, and he started talking about how fantasy sports was a $2 billion industry and blah 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 blah. And Peter Gethers is sitting there on the stage, and I at the other end of the stage from me, and I look over, and he has his head in his hands, and he's shaking his head. This guy has more money than God. He invented Kate and Alley. Okay, he's fine. He wants for nothing. All right, but his head is in his hands, like thinking about the millions, the billions that could have been theirs, right? And then the moderator turns around and he looks at me and he goes, but FX, you were the only one that got them real money, I think. And what was the advance you got them? And I said, $2,000 each. And the whole audience just like, you know, roared and groaned. And, you know, it's really quite amazing to have had the opportunity to have kind of, you know, helped kick a few logs into the fire that has turned into this incredible world of sports consumption. It's so different now. And, you know, even the whole normalization of the betting on everything, you know, I think it's all rooted in the fact that there was that this idea popped out and came alive, and it would have popped out no matter what, someplace, somewhere. I was privileged, super privileged in my life to have I might not have been in the room where it was born, but I was certainly patrolling the nursery, you know, shortly afterwards.
Yes, you were.
Okay, who else we got? Anybody else got some questions? Other than look at my team and why do I suck?
I wanted to ask how many collective pennants are in the room. I'll fess up to 2.
I got 2. I've got 2 pennants, but it took a lot. I was luckier than you were, FX, but it took a long time to get my second flag.
Yeah, like I've said, this is my first year doing it. You know, being a Canadian boy, something that got me into simulations and stuff was they were actually university classmates with my brother, and took Tony La Russa baseball, and everybody got a team. We drafted players in the whole bit, and we started playing. We had a couple seasons of that, and this was when the internet started it in about 94. And I found some hockey leagues, and I did that for a lot of years, ran my own. But in about the last 5-6 years, I have found baseball fantasy leagues, which is completely different, but kind of the similar, you know, you're being a GM.
Yeah.
And, you know,
And
and they all have different.
It gives you that excuse to follow what's going on in all the games every day. And that's unbelievably satisfying.
And in a lot of them, they don't, you know, they might start out with the players that are playing today. Some of the leagues I'm in actually have gone back to 1900 with the software, or 1911. But then, you know, once you get to today, well, then the game starts making up players. And,
Right.
you know, and then it's just purely baseball. So, I mean, like you said, I mean, this small thing that started has ballooned into so much more. Incredible. And I've actually been doing some research. I talked to Derek about it. I'm hoping to present. Someday they'll accept it at SABR for me to present, but it's not books and stuff, and it's a little bit odd out there. But basically going back and taking one author, created the best team for every franchise and wrote a book a few years ago. Well, I've taken that and I'm simulating them to see, based on like today's playoffs and everything else, to see what is the greatest franchise. Where it comes into real interesting is using, you know, the new wild card rules. And that is, I think some of the interesting information to be, how many times does a wild card team actually win versus one of the 6 division winners? And there's, you know, and the databases and the whole bit, you know, does Barry Bonds and Babe Ruth always lead the home runs? And I'll share that little tidbit. No, they don't. You know?
Right. No.
Even though you're right, you know, running the same simulation every time, it's not. The purists are like, well, you know, you got to run this many times. Well, we've had a few guys do presentations this year and they're going, you would never be able to calculate how many variables go into that. And they laugh because most of them have been programmers, and they get lucky and they get one baseball guy in there to explain things. So anyway,
Well, I will share. I'll share a great SABR story with you guys that I was very happy to witness. So Jim Bouton was the featured speaker at the Seattle convention. I don't know how many of you might have been there, but Bouton got up at the banquet, or the luncheon banquet, and he went on for about 20 minutes, and basically his message was, SABR has to figure out how to redo the stats because of the steroids, and, you know, correct the home runs so that they're more realistic. And he went on and on about it, right? Rousing applause. Okay, that was Saturday. Late the next morning, I'm checking out of the hotel. I check out. I go out into the sidewalk. A buddy of mine who lives in that neck of the woods was going to pick me up and drop me off at the airport. A guy named Mark Armour, you might have heard of. And Doug, for your benefit, Mark is currently the president of SABR. So I'm waiting for Mark to show up, and I strike up a conversation with Lyle Spatz, who really is one of the grand guys of SABR, and he ran the records committee for 30 years. And Lyle and I are talking, and Lyle goes, you know, what did you think about what Bouton had to say? And before I could answer, out the front door onto the sidewalk, right between us, is Jim Bouton. And I said, Jim, I'd like to introduce you to Lyle Spatz. I had a chance to meet him the day before because I was on the board. I said, Jim, I'd like to introduce you to Lyle Spatz. He's the head of the records committee. If any group in SABR is going to work on the problem that you recommended that we work on, it's going to be Lyle's committee. And Lyle looks at Bouton and he goes, so Jim, my first question is, Okay, we go in, we figure out how to adjust the home runs. Now, how do we adjust the pitcher's records so that the books balance? And Boughton looks at him and he thinks, and he kind of scowls and he goes, you guys are the only ones who give a shit about that stuff.
Now you're reminding me of a really cool story of one of the great quotes I ever had that never made it into a story. And my son has spread this out. I was doing a story on technology invading statistics in baseball and general management and even the dugout. And they wanted to call it computers in the dugout. So I had a major league pass to go into all of these places for like a month. I went to Baltimore. I went to, I forgot, Shea, Yankee Stadium, whatever, Chicago. I'm on the Yankees field on hallowed ground next to the batting cage. And it was the era of Winfield and Ricky Henderson and those guys. So Ricky Henderson is taking BP, and they have this thing about who gets in and how many swings you get and all this shit. So Henderson gets out of the batting cage and he looks at me like, what are you doing here? He's a short, stocky guy, and he was famous for being very abrupt and not very articulate. So I told him he goes, who are you? And I told him who I was, and I introduced myself and said, I'm working on this story about stats and this and that. And how do you think about computers, helping, manage the way baseball is played? And he gave me this look and he said, can a computer steal second base? And he said, fuck no. And he walked away. When my son heard that, he said, oh man, I got to spread this one around. That was Ricky.
Well, I would end by noting that the last line in the Rotisserie League baseball book comes at the end of Steve Wolf's chapter, the last chapter of the book. And in that chapter, Steve writes about talking about Rotisserie League baseball with various people in baseball. And he concludes by explaining it to Yogi Berra, who, of course, as every New York kid knows and remembers and loves, Yogi Berra was the spokesperson for Yoo-Hoo. And so when what are we going to do if you win the pennant? Well, it's the Rotisserie League. It's okay, it's a pennant, but you're not going to get champagne poured over your head. You're going to get Yoo-Hoo poured over your head. And so Steve explains all this to Yogi, and Yogi looks at him and goes, ooh, oi. Which is, of course, Yoo-Hoo backwards. And that's how the book ends.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Well, being in Canada, I've never had a Yoo-Hoo, so Derek, I'm gonna leave the last word for you.
Well, first of all, FX and Doug, appreciate having you guys on. Lots of great stories. I'm sure, a lot of us, it seems like we've been in leagues for a long time. And I remember, USA Today subscription, the Tuesday and the Wednesday paper, and manually entering the stats every week. And, showing up at a draft with the, sporting news magazines and different things. And then the next draft I showed up at, everybody had the same magazine, so nobody had an advantage anymore. Just to touch on, like you said, it's amazing, what that kind of, from that one league, what it has sparked, not only in terms of, fantasy sports in general, just the amount of statistics that are available at our fingertips now, just a couple buttons on my phone and I can pull up, all the latest and greatest stats, you said you used to have to wait for the morning paper, and that didn't have the late box scores and everything. So it's just amazing how much it's grown, and how many people enjoy it. So I appreciate your like you said, your piece in that, in growing, spreading the word, and getting fantasy baseball out there to the masses.
So, Derek, if you don't mind, I do want to give one more anecdote, because you mentioned USA Today, and I should have mentioned this earlier. But after the book came out, there were a lot of leagues that got formed, and that grew. And in 1985, one of the owners in the Rotisserie League, a woman by the name Valerie Saliembe.
She was in the first league. Yes.
Yeah,
Valerie.
she was one of the founding fathers.
Yes.
And Valerie ran marketing for USA Today, and she told us in the summer of 1985, when USA Today had full nationwide distribution and had the newspapers in boxes, and it was free, right? So if you're walking down a city street, there was a box that had USA Today in it.
And hotel room doors. Yeah.
That's right. And she said that the overwhelming reports that they were getting from every city in the country during the baseball season was that the papers were flying off the racks, and the trash cans nearby were filled up with every section but the sports section.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that. I'm definitely guilty of doing that.
and Valerie later on at that Cooperstown event, she said that there's no question in her mind that Rotisserie League Baseball was a significant contributor to the success of USA Today.
Good point. Excellent point. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, then.
You guys reminded me of something, though.
Okay, Jason.
Well, it's just
Go
funny
for it.
because I spent the year 1990-91 abroad in London, and the only way I could get any baseball coverage, the International Herald Tribune, and all they had were line scores, the old line scores, and it was so painful. So I got my mom to start mailing me my baseball weeklies all the way to London, so that I could go back and read the box scores, because I had no idea what was going on in the games just by reading old line scores. So, once you become addicted to these things, you just, there's no substitute.
It's true. It's true. All right.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. We, as FX mentioned about doing this again in about 16 months or so, I think we're all for it, provided Derek and I are still chairing. Maybe if not, then whoever chairs will have to look after that.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
As a committee, although there's not many here, Derek and I have talked, and we are planning to let our name stand again for another year. And we both will be in Chicago, so make sure you reach out to us. We will have an announcement of what we are doing. We think we've got our day to have our time. We put in, I think we were probably one of the first ones, and they were trying to sell us, oh, well, maybe you don't need this and that. We said, no, we want this and that. And hopefully it all works out. So hopefully we'll have an announcement in the next couple of days for you on that. So keep your eyes open.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody. Derek, final word?
Yeah, no, I just, again, thanks everyone for attending, and hopefully have some more guests lined up in the near future here. And hope you guys can make it to Chicago. If not, we might have some virtual stuff that you can participate in if you're not there.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah. We very well may have some virtual stuff. That's going to be huge.
All right, good night, guys.
All right, take
Night,
care.
everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon, FX.